This computer is it? Okay, I think everything should be working right now. I hope. All right, let's do this. Okay, well, hello everyone. Welcome to another edition of 1+1, your place for inconvenient truth telling and myth busting. And my guest for this evening is Alison Bodine of Fire This Time. She is a Venezuelan Latin American solidarity activist, journalist, and educator. And Alison is also an anti-war and climate justice and social justice organizer based in Vancouver and in the unceded traditional territories of the Coast Salish people of the Squamish and of the Squamish, Musqueam, and how do I say the first one, Alison?
The Tsleil-Waututh.
The Tsleil-Waututh people, and she regularly publishes articles on climate justice, migrant and refugee issues, and Venezuela, and is on the editorial board of Fire This Time newspaper. And you can find her articles in all sorts of places like Venezuelanalysis, globalresearch.ca, Council on Hemispheric Affairs, Common Dreams Monthly Review, the Canada Files, and we've had members of the Canada Files on this show, and of course CounterPunch. And Alison is the coordinator of, as I mentioned, of Fire This Time, which is a Venezuela solidarity campaign group, and is the author, I did not know this, so that's on my list of books to get, of Revolution and Counter-Revolution in Venezuela, which is at Battle of Ideas Press. And she has been a speaker and participant at international anti-war and anti-imperialist conferences in Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua, Ireland, England, and the US, and has even given lectures at the Bolivarian University of Venezuela. So first off, Ms. Bodine, thank you so much for coming on the program.
Thank you, Youri. It's really a pleasure to be here, and thanks for the fantastic introduction.
And by the way, it's an honor to have you because you're one of many Canadian Americans I've found on the program who I've actually seen many times in other online events where I've gotten a chance to either, ask questions during a Q&A and so forth. So it's a real honor to have you, and because I love the work you do. And given that incredible background, and given that incredible background, that's a perfect segue to this question, to my first question, which is, can you talk about your background and how you got involved in solidarity work with Latin America? And after you answered that, because you do a lot of solidarity work in Venezuela, what were some of the positive social transformations you witnessed the Chavez and later Maduro governments implement that you were shocked semi-NGOs keep omitting and that media and academics aren't reporting on when they do, talk about Venezuela?
So, like a lot of people, learning about the tremendous social movements and movements for socialism and traditional governments in Latin America has really changed my political perspective and my life in a lot of ways. I am currently, as you said, on the editorial board of the Fire This Time newspaper and chair of the Fire This Time Movement for Social Justice Venezuela Solidarity Campaign, and have been active with Latin American solidarity since, shortly after graduating high school in the early 2000s. I first went to Cuba in 2006 with the IFCO Pastors for Peace caravan to Cuba. So as someone, I had just, I'd moved here to Canada after graduating high school. I knew very little about Cuba, but I knew a lot about war in a lot of ways. I was in high school when the US invaded Afghanistan, when the US invaded Iraq, and that had really opened my eyes and burst the suburban bubble that I grew up in. So when I moved to Vancouver, I was looking to be involved. I wanted to stay active in the anti-war movement. I came across organizers with the Fire This Time movement for social justice, became active and involved, and then found out about Cuba, which was basically not talked about when I was in high school. I probably could have found it on a map, and that was about it. But the opportunity arose in 2006 to go there and see Cuba for myself, to really learn about the impact of the cruel US blockade, and about the ways that Cubans had transformed their society since the 1959 Cuban Revolution. Of course, learn about Fidel and Che and their ideas, and see this transitional society, this socialist project in action. And since then, I've really been, honored to be part of an international movement that stands with the people of Cuba against the criminal blockade, and to find out so much more about what it means to be only 90 miles from the United States and saying, no, we're building an independent and sovereign country of our own design. And that's what Venezuela is doing as well. When Chavez was first elected in 1998, I could recall maybe a few instances of hearing on the news about Venezuela. Venezuela was always within the targets of the United States. And so the campaign of demonization of the government of Chavez started very early. He was elected in 1998 and became president of Venezuela, immediately enacting tremendous social changes that lifted many people out of poverty, that gave power to people's communities, and that transformed the history of Venezuela, needless to say, that the history of a lot of Latin America, and still does to this day. And so when I got the opportunity, here in Vancouver, we would participate in solidarity actions with Venezuela. We would help organize educational events, but I didn't actually travel to Venezuela for the first time until 2018. And so that was after Comandante Chavez passed away, and after the US really tightened the screws on Venezuela. The people of Venezuela, like the people of Cuba, have had to fight against sanctions which have strangled their economy, made it virtually impossible to have any sort of normal business transactions, all with the same goal, which is to overthrow and convince the people of Venezuela to overthrow their democratically elected government. So it was in 2015 that the Obama administration declared Venezuela a threat to US national security. And that was, after years of US supported coup attempts, of definitely US intervention in Venezuela to attempt to reverse the gains of the Bolivarian revolutionary process. 2015, and when Obama introduced the executive order declaring Venezuela to be an extraordinary threat to the national security of the United States, that really laid the groundwork for administrative sanctions and essentially a blockade that's still in place to this day. Because cynically, of course, the government of the United States saw the passing of Hugo Chavez as the opportunity to try and really strangle once and for all the Bolivarian revolutionary process. So when I first traveled to Venezuela in 2018, it was visiting a society that had made tremendous gains for women's rights, for the rights of poor, working, and oppressed people, a society where people you could see were, organized at a community level, and really felt that power and had so much support for their government, despite the terrible economic situation, despite really the fact that their economy was being strangled and sabotaged from a US-backed right wing. And since then, I've been fortunate to have been to Venezuela, I think 7 or 8 times, and learned much more in depth about the tremendous social transformation taking place there. I think it plays such a central role in my work, but primarily from the point of view that I think is most important for people living in the US and Canada, which is that, yes, Venezuela and Cuba and their revolutions are a tremendous example for all poor, working, and oppressed people. But the most important work that we also do from here, and what what Jose Marti called the belly of the beast, is that we organize against our own government's attempts to intervene in people's social movements and in revolutionary processes that are taking place. So I focus most of my time on organizing against US sanctions on Venezuela, demanding that the government of the United States respect the sovereignty and self-determination of the people of Venezuela, and trying to bring people together in an organized way to have a consistent and coordinated campaign to elevate these demands to both the White House and here in Canada to Parliament Hill. And all of that work is only possible because of the day-to-day resistance of the people of Venezuela. And when they are out in the streets, they are defending some of those gains, you know. I think you had mentioned earlier about the fact that in Venezuela, working, you know, mothers who do work from home, who take care of children, receive a salary for work that has been recognized, you know, has never been recognized as actual paid work under any other government. And I think that's just one of the many amazing things that the government of Venezuela has done for people, and that people have, you know, demanded. And it's incredible to visit and to observe the relationship, you know, between people and a government, to observe a society where, in sharp contrast to so much of their daily lives here in the United States or Canada, people are engaged. People are wanting to participate in the democratic process in their country. They're not cynical. They're not, you know, dismissive of their government. They are very much wanting to build society in a positive and progressive direction.
And can you talk about you know, one of the things that you must have witnessed when you went to Venezuela? Can you talk about Chavez's extraordinary programs to eliminate illiteracy, in which you had women as old as, you know, 80 something, or some even in their 90s, learning to read and write for the first time?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the great gains that's been carried forward from the example of the Cuban Revolution. The Cuban Revolution brought complete literacy to the island, eradicated illiteracy within the first 2 years by sending brigades of, you know, even people that were 12 or 13 years old out to teach people how to read. And since then, Cuba has developed programs that are transferable to other countries and other contexts. So Venezuela took that program and very quickly started multiple levels of educational programming and investments in order to educate people, you know, adults in literacy, but also programs to make, you know, high schools accessible to people, to encourage people to continue through post-secondary education. And education definitely became one of the main focuses of the revolutionary process in Venezuela. And I think it's so interesting and such a stark contrast to what people may think about countries like Venezuela, countries that they're told are very like top down and people are just doing what they're told, or they're coerced into supporting a government.
Or they'll say that it's overly bureaucratic. I think that's how they often say, and that because of that, there's a lot of incompetency in both Venezuela and Cuba.
Right, and never mention sanctions ever. They never talk about the U.S.'s hand.
Well, yeah, but that's because they're tyrannical governments, remember? Right. So.
But to think that the basis of Venezuela in so many ways is a push for more education, is the concept that people can make informed political decisions only when they have access to information that they can read and understand. And that's why literacy is so important. And I think there's those social programs continue until today. I've talked to many people who work in Musqueam Robinson, which is one of those social programs focused on literacy and education. And it's just such a process of community work, a process of reaching out to people and not letting people go by the wayside, but drawing people into society, drawing people into a process of change and like self improvement, but in such a community and collective way that you don't see in many ways in the US or Canada. And I think that program, and also the programs that for housing, I think are especially critical for us to talk about right now.
Actually, talk a bit more about that. Yeah, talk a bit more about the housing program.
So Misión Gran Vivienda, or the Great Housing Mission in Venezuela, is something that I've observed in multiple ways. It has, a few different ways that it goes about. I've, visited places that basically were housing missions built in order to bring people out of the hills, out of unsafe housing conditions or crowded housing conditions, and to build apartments and invite people to move into them and to become homeowners. This is not done on a scale of even 10,000 or 30,000 houses. This is in the millions that they've provided, the government has provided housing for people and fundamentally changed their lives. Even in the context of a blockade and sanctions, the Misión Gran Vivienda and the construction of 5 million houses has still been a fundamental part of the Bolivarian revolutionary process. And also, I've been able to visit another model of Misión Gran Vivienda, which is that people are given the time and the tools and the education to actually build their own housing. So collectives of people have come together, learned how to become, some people will learn how to become electricians, others plumbers, and actually building from the ground up an apartment for them to live in. These things, of course, take time to learn all of that, but the process of doing it together is another a way of building that kind of social power in Venezuela that I've been able to observe, and just meeting people that never thought they'd have a house, let alone learn how to construct their own house, has really been an amazing process that I encourage people to read more about and learn more about, especially at a time when housing, here in Vancouver, British Columbia, is in a critical state. There is not enough housing, it is very expensive, but there's other ways that society can be built so that housing can become a human right, not just a commodity to be bought and sold. And I think that's one of those so-called dangerous lessons that Venezuela is offering to the world.
And can you talk and you already mentioned this from the from the get-go, and I talked about this with Dr. Maria Paez Victor about it. And it still blows my mind that a government would even do this for its women, but that Chavez and the Maduro government actually pay single mothers or stay-at-home mothers or mothers with very dependent, needy children and from all walks of life, actually pay them as if they were sort of like domestic servants or like cleaning ladies, but they actually give them a kind of a UBI. They recognize that what they do as work. Can you talk a bit more about that and how much that's actually and how that's actually lifted many women and their families from extreme poverty?
Many women I've talked to in Venezuela especially are especially proud of the fact that Chavez openly declared himself a feminist. And one of this policy that he pushed for, but the people of Venezuela supported, is one of those that is often raised as an important contribution to the advancement of women's rights in Venezuela. Women in Venezuela have many other rights to fight for, but this one is especially one that has been a great gain. And I think something that's important to understand about it as well is that it's not just at the time, that you may be rearing children, but it's also recognized to the extent that you can get a pension. You get your pension based on that work as well. So it's not just for the time in which you are being a stay-at-home mom. It's recognized as your life's work in some ways. And I think that sort of bringing and recognizing of women's work is very important, because women economic situation in the country is so often a barrier to women becoming involved in society, becoming leaders within social movements, because they're really the glue that holds together so much of the social fabric, and can therefore not devote as much time to becoming political leaders. But you can see in Venezuela the way that women often hold very important positions within the communities and within the government of Venezuela, that being able to, from the basis of something like the law that you're describing, being able to continue to elevate women's rights throughout all levels of society is something that we've definitely been able to learn about. I think that, again, it's all within the context of US sanctions and, a blockade on the country, which makes further advancement more difficult. And that's one of the goals of US sanctions and the strangling of an economy is they definitely don't want women to, hold more power or to organize their communities better. They want Venezuelan women to become burdened with waiting in long lines for food, taking care of sick children, and not being able to access the medicines. This is the kind of society that the US constructs or is wanting to construct, so that women will not become active in defending Venezuela's self-determination and independence, and will instead be busied with the difficult work of holding families together under sanctions. And so I think we especially have to recognize the unequal impact of blockades and sanctions have on women in Venezuela.
Before I ask you, what's your assessment of Nicolas Maduro and the intense propaganda that's leveled at not just him, but also Daniel Ortega in similar states in Latin America. And then I have to ask this question. When you were talking about the social justice programs of Cuba, as well as the late Hugo Chavez, where the hell are the NGOs on all this? Like, why are so many NGOs? How come they don't recognize those social achievements as major achievements in human rights? And when they do talk about human rights, it's this very I would say, I would say it's mostly fake news, but when they do talk about human rights, they basically recycle propaganda done by the Canadian states, the British states, members of the EU, and of course American whatnots.
I mean, I think you've said it right on point, as far as a lot of these NGOs are just mouthpieces of the United States and other imperialist governments. The definition of human rights that they weaponize is often based on access to consumer goods, and then also, of course, their nefarious definitions of freedom of speech, which are often used against oppressed countries around the world. I think that we definitely have to reconceive of human rights as access to housing and healthcare and education, basic social justice, and that helps us understand completely the violations of the United States government of human rights. And I think we also have to be very careful, as I'm sure you've talked to lots of folks about and researched about, ties between the really direct ties between a lot of these non-governmental organizations or NGOs.
Exactly, they actually should be called semi-NGOs when you really think about it nowadays.
and the USAID, the U.S. Agency for International Development, or in Canada, it's called CEDA, and it's very much these direct ties to so-called democracy building programs. I mean, in Venezuela, the government of Canada is constantly boasting about giving money to democracy building in Venezuela, and they give a human rights award every year to a member of the opposition, which is often a direct way, really, of intervening in a country. They're transferring thousands of dollars, tens of thousands, even hundreds of thousands of dollars to
And
organizations.
these people don't want to improve. These people do not want to improve the social justice achievements and policies of Chavez and Maduro. No, in fact, they explicitly want to roll all that stuff back.
Exactly. Yeah, they want to make Venezuela more friendly to business clients. They have all sorts of excuses, but it's pretty paper thin, really. And it's just often ludicrous to see in a country, like Venezuela, where community radio, community media publications has been like a component of the Bolivarian Revolution, really grassroots development of media has been very supported by the government. To see like the U.S. government's transferring money to journalists who are speaking out and are supposedly oppressed is really important to expose as part of our work. But like you said, fundamentally to reframe how we consider what human rights are, and why is it that we don't consider housing, water, education, food to be human rights.
Then that's a perfect segue to this question before I ask about the case of Alex Saab, which is, what's your assessment of Nicolas Maduro? Because I know, just like in Nicaragua under Daniel Ortega or Jean-Bertrand Aristide of Haiti, there's been ex-members of such and such this party, or those who loved Chavez but now spend most of their time, pardon my language, shitting on Maduro, that he's economically illiterate, he has authoritarian tendencies. I don't know if you're familiar with the allegations or the criticisms of Eva Gollinger or the UK academic Julia Buxton. But yeah, what's your response on the on the criticisms of Maduro? Do you feel that there are half-truths to any of it, or do you think that Maduro is just a victim of just non-stop propaganda, much like Daniel Ortega, twice during the 80s and nowadays, and Jean-Bertrand Aristide back in the 90s, and even before the 2004 coup against him in Haiti?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I've been fortunate, first of all, to say that I've been part of Venezuela's election process a number of times as an electoral observer. So often U.S. or Canada capitalist media really portrays the President Nicolas Maduro or presidents of other countries that are duly elected. They take the opportunity of the elections to claim that these people are not duly elected, and to really raise up the dial when it comes to demonizing the leaders of countries which they sanction and do not, have really targeted for overthrow. So I've been part of elections and observed, people's very real votes. Venezuela has one of the world's most recognized democratic voting systems, just, the physical voting machines, double counting, independent observation and counting is really airtight, essentially, even as declared by something like the Jimmy Carter Institute in the United States. So I fully believe and understand that President Nicolas Maduro was elected by the people of Venezuela. Just as a side note, I will say I was also in Nicaragua for the recent election of Daniel Ortega and observed as well that the elections.
We're gonna have to get you back on the program to talk about both Cuba and Nicaragua, but
these elections were peaceful. They were participatory, and people were involved in a way that doesn't happen here in so many ways. But to go back to kind of your question of assessment, I mean, I think President Nicolas Maduro has continued the programs and initiatives of Chavez. The context in which they're taking place has changed in some ways, and but on the whole, I would say that the goal of the Bolivarian Revolution is continued, and the implementation of programs that elevate the voices and the lives of poor, working, and oppressed people in Venezuela, that project continues on. And so I think it is very difficult to really, point to something like you said, perhaps Maduro's accusations of Maduro's economic illiteracy, and then avoid any sort of serious discussion about sanctions or blockade. I disagree that there's any way, or I disagree with how nonchalantly people throw that off sometimes. Like, oh, it's just sanctions, or it's just blockade. That can't be the reason for everything. But fundamentally understanding that despite cooperative relationships that the government of Venezuela has been able to build with other countries like Iran or Russia or China, that the US government still controls so much of the world economy, the vast majority of the world economy, and can still prevent countries from any sort of normal business, and how fundamentally that distorts the economy is, I think, has to be taken into account in any sort of like serious assessment.
Yeah.
You know, needless to say as well that, like I've said, I think my main job as someone living in Canada is not to criticize the government of another country, but is to deal with the government of Canada and the government of the United States, where I live and organize. So I think the economy is really difficult to discuss because of the way that Venezuela is being cut off from the rest of the world. And I think that Venezuela basically has two main tasks right now, that the government of Venezuela has two main tasks. And one is that it has to develop and continue developing what I'll call a resistance economy, an economy that resists the strangulation by the United States, the blockade, the sanctions, that enables Venezuela to continue fighting against imperialist intervention. And then two, to continue with the progressive measures and reforms. And like I said, I think that is happening in Venezuela. And so I don't really subscribe to the necessity to pick apart the details as someone that doesn't live in Venezuela myself, but more so to point to those two pretty basic things that I think are necessities and are happening in Venezuela, and then to say, okay, people living not in Venezuela, what are we going to do together? What we really need to do is to come together and let Venezuela's economy breathe in a lot of ways. That was it's been a slogan in Cuba solidarity movements as well. Let Venezuela economy operate, under normal conditions, and then let's see what the government of Venezuela is doing. And like I said, Venezuela has built these cooperative relationships with other countries that are under sanctions and siege, countries like Cuba, Iran, Russia, China. I think that's very, very important to understand and to pay attention to. But it's nothing compared to the whole United States government seizing Citgo, seizing a company, a Venezuelan oil company that was selling gas in the United States, seizing it, taking all of its assets and giving them to the puppet government of Juan Guaido, handing over millions of dollars of wealth of the people of Venezuela. Or the fact that the government of England, the Bank of England, or their court system right now is withholding $2 billion of Venezuelan gold, refusing to give it to the duly elected government of President Nicolas Maduro. And then with the other hand, the same government of the UK says, oh, but Venezuelans can't control their economy. People are standing in long lines for food. And they're holding $2 billion. They've stolen, they've committed theft. And all of this is enabled by the international banking system and by so much of the world political, landscape that is controlled by the United States government and their imperialist allies.
Well, then I have to ask this question now: why, unlike the Vietnam War or even opposition to World War I or the second invasion and colonization of Iraq, that Venezuela, Haiti, Nicaragua, and even Bolivia, when Evo was overthrown and they were briefly under the rule of Christian fascists, just doesn't, like, why do we not see the level of mass mobilized efforts to end these ghastly, grotesque, imperial, bloody capitalist conquests? Why Iraq, for example, one of the great slogans even during the first Gulf War was "No war for oil." Why don't we see that in Venezuela? And I mean, even if Maduro was this totalitarian, over the top, strong men that that the propagandists, depict them out. Even if that was true, I mean, you had people who who were against communists, but they protest against the Vietnam War, and people who probably would never vote for Assad or Gaddafi, but recognize that it's an imperial war. So why don't we have that when it comes to Venezuela, Haiti, Nicaragua, and so forth?
That, I mean, I think there's just a real lack of coordination and leadership on our part as far as left forces and activists. Unfortunately, imperialist governments learned a lot of lessons from the mass movement of people in the United States and the mass movement in Vietnam that eventually ended the Vietnam War with a loss for the United States. They learned their lessons, I think, much better, unfortunately, than we did, as far as the left. And so there is a lot of work to be done. I think I got involved at a time when the war in Iraq went from being mass protests in the streets that didn't stop the war to being an occupation. And so many people around the world demobilized, and I would say were demobilized. I think political forces around the world said, okay, we've let these people have their protests. They should come off the streets now. On the whole, we support the war in Iraq, and that includes here in Canada and the UK, where it was essentially social democratic governments that said, come off the streets, people. We don't want a real anti-war movement. Actually, we were okay with your protest against the war in Iraq, but we want you to stop organizing against it now because we're worried that it's become something more serious and something more capable of making fundamental change in society. And so I think we're still dealing with a lot of that sentiment in society of people saying, well, big protests didn't work to stop the war in Iraq, and what can we do? But overall, I think that just means we need more unity and more coordination between each other. That's why I appreciate this interview a lot and like the work you've been doing, because I think we have to be able to talk to each other more about what we should be doing and what we can do together in order to do public education campaigns, mobilizations, and to take this opportunity when people, I think, are beginning to see a lot of the cracks in the US government's propaganda, are beginning to see the way that, for example, Cuba dealt with the pandemic and compare it to the United States and say, how did that happen? I thought Cuba was a poor country, that government didn't care about its people. How come basically, how come so many few people died? How did Cuba develop 5 vaccines? Or in Venezuela, how is it that despite the sanctions and lack of access to food and medicine, how come the government in Venezuela is still there and
notice how they didn't have an anti-vax, anti-mask, anti-lockdown libertarian-esque movement amongst their left compared to.
So I think that the material is there and growing as far as people seeing the cracks in capitalist society. And that just means we have to work harder. We have to do more education and coordination with each other, like I said, and work to build campaigns, because imperialism is constantly campaigning. They've got a million things to distract people or to channelize people's anger into other forces besides building a mass movement. And so I hope that people will learn about Venezuela and will continue to ask those critical questions, and that we can build a movement that's there to say, and yes, there's something to get involved in. There's a way to participate, take that anger, turn it into something else constructive, and work to end sanctions and attacks on Venezuela. Because if those end, then also people in the US and Canada will be able to elevate our own our own lives as well. You know, a victory for one really is a victory for all, and we've seen that as elections and changes have been coming across Latin America, that countries are really and social movements are building off of one another, and understanding each other's victories will have an impact on them. And we have to be able to bring that to poor working and oppressed people in the belly of the beast in the US and Canada and other imperialist countries.
Before we get to the questionnaire, because we're running out of time, I have to ask two quick brieflies. What is the please tell people what is the case of Alex Saab and how they can get involved. And then I have to ask this question because we talked about this a little bit off the air. Is now you're originally from Colorado, but but you're based in Canada. What do you think it's going to take for the people power movements in the U.S. to show stronger solidarity to Native Americans and Indigenous Hawaiians and Alaskans, like it is in Canada with solidarity towards the plight of First Nations, Métis, and the Inuit people?
Sure. So first about Alex Saab, part of the Venezuela solidarity work I've been doing as the coordinator of the Fire This Time Movement for Social Justice Venezuela Solidarity Campaign. We've been working with something called the Winnipeg Venezuela Peace Committee, as well as a group called Just Peace Advocates, and some other individuals and organizations across Canada to have monthly picket actions for an end to Canada's sanctions on Venezuela, and also to free Alex Saab, which I think is a very important international campaign right now. Alex Saab is a Venezuelan diplomat who has been either under house arrest, detained, or in U.S. jail for over 800 days. He was working for the government of Venezuela as a diplomat to negotiate contracts with Iran for food and medicines that Venezuelans needed to contribute to a program called the CLAP program, which is kind of like a monthly food basket that Venezuelan families have access to at very subsidized prices to help build their basic nutrition during a time of sanctions and blockade. And so Alex Saab was, helping Venezuela conduct business with another sanctioned country, Iran. He stopped to refuel his plane in Cabo Verde in Africa, and was arrested by authorities there on behest of the US government. He was held in Cape Verde for a number of months under house arrest, faced torture.
Under the guise that he violated the US's sanctions on Iran, in which nobody's allowed to do certain business with Iran, or
that's the underlying allegations. On the whole, the US government's built a case based on international money laundering, and they are able to they come up with other cases of evidence in order to arrest and hold people. So I think in general they conveyed to the government of Cape Verde that this was like an international criminal, and that's all they had to do in order to get his arrest and detention. They've really yet to have to produce any actual evidence against Alex Saab and to justify his detention and being held in jail. He was kidnapped from Cape Verde in October of last year, so just about a year ago, and then has been in jail in Florida since then. There were a number of charges against him, and only one is stuck through the US court system, and that is related to like financial crimes and money laundering. But very clear political case. The US government, of course, it's illegal under international law for US sanctions to be enforced extraterritorially outside of the United States. So the US is couching all of their charges in other legislation and other ways. But fundamentally, the legal question, which we can organize around and which we should tell people, is that Alex Saab is a diplomat and has diplomatic immunity. And this was recognized even by Mark Esper, who was the former US Defense Secretary under Trump. In his book, he talks about the case of Alex Saab, and he talks about the US knowing full well that Alex Saab was a diplomat when they ordered his arrest in Cabo Verde. And so these are things that are quite well known, at least in the US government. And I think that builds a strong case for us to be able to say to people in the United States that this person is being held unjustly and for political reasons as part of the US's campaign against Venezuela. And his family, particularly his wife, Camila Saab, I've been honored to be able to host events where she's speaking, and it's just really stood up for him, as well as the people of Venezuela, who constantly are mobilizing for his freedom. So within the US and Canada, that has to be one of our central campaigns, is to demand his freedom. With a lot of, with this trial, I guess in particular, I'll say, keeps getting postponed and through different courts in the US. And I think it's a bit of a game to see how long they can hold him. But in either case, what will really free him is if people in the United States stand with people in Venezuela and demand his freedom, as has won the release of other political prisoners, or prisoners being held for political reasons, including the Cuban Five.
Yeah,
so,
and just before we get to the brief questionnaire, when do you think it's going? What do you think it's going to take for the people power movements in the U.S. To show stronger solidarity to Indigenous people, the way the Canadian left people power movements have done towards their Indigenous people?
Yeah, I think I work, as you mentioned, in the environmental justice and social justice movement, and I think one of the first actually things upon moving to Canada you observe is, at least in Vancouver, kind of more general awareness about Indigenous people than in the United States. The reserves are often closer to cities, and I think there's just more interaction in society, at least here on the West Coast. But the subtle racism runs really deep, and police targeting and killing of Indigenous peoples, the murdered and missing Indigenous women in Canada, domestic violence against Indigenous women and two-spirited people, has statistics very similar to the United States, I would say.
Exactly.
There's very little difference as far as both countries being founded on genocide and systems of ripping Indigenous people out of their cultures and communities. In Canada, they're referred to as residential schools. And I think the kind of reckoning and the work of Indigenous people around awareness around residential schools, the discovery of the unmarked graves of children that took place just in the last year, showing exactly how many thousands of children died in the residential school system, which was supported by the state of Canada as well as by the church, including the Catholic Church. There has been more general awareness raised about Indigenous people, but the government still works very hard, and kind of the state of Canada works very hard to drive that wedge of racism between regular poor working and oppressed people in Canada and Indigenous people. And I think there have been some good steps made by progressives in Canada to fight against that racism, to build more general awareness. But a lot of it has also come on the backs of Indigenous people doing a lot of the work as far as raising awareness of their own situation. And so I think there's a lot more that we need to do, and in recognition, especially of the Canada participates in wars and occupations abroad alongside the United States, but there's a war being waged against people at home too, and that often comes in attacks on communities of color and on Indigenous people. And so that's why it has to become such a fundamental part of our work. And perhaps the environment movement has also done some work to raise more awareness about Indigenous rights in Canada. Indigenous people have been able to assert their rights and title alongside environmental activists, and won some good victories. And so that might have been a boost as well. But I mean, overall, I think there's a lot of important work that must be taken up still. Because a lot of it, we might end up
do you think if some Canadians or move to the US, not to become rock stars and actors like Jim Carrey or Neil Young, but to I don't know, maybe push more of the American left and like focus more on like indigenous people, that maybe that might turn over a new leaf for.
I wish it was that simple. I mean, I agree there's some more steps taken, but we also risk it becoming very performative. You know, people saying land acknowledgements of territories and things does happen more in Canada, but does it translate to actual solidarity with Indigenous peoples fighting for their self-determination? Does it actually come with an understanding of what genocide and colonization means? Or is it just something that you say at the beginning of an event? So there's definitely more general education, but still I would say that the fundamental, everyday society is pretty similar between the US and Canada when it comes to Indigenous.
As John Pilger would say, when it comes to his own country of Australia, nothing's going to change until we right the wrongs of the bloody past. Anything we do is only have victories, and we're only half won. And until we give them back their nationhood, we can never claim our own. And Miss Bodine, and just before I let you go, all right, it's time to do the usually end the program now with the questionnaire done by Marcel Proust, later French broadcaster Bernard Pivot, and then my hero James Lipton of Inside the Actors Studio. So, all righty, here it goes. Miss Bodine, what is your favorite word?
Justice.
What's your least favorite words?
Ignorance.
What turns you on spiritually, emotionally, or creatively?
The struggle for just and noble causes.
And then what turns you off?
Ignorance again.
Then what sound or noise do you love, followed by what sound or noise do you dislike?
I love the sound of birds. I dislike the sound of the airplanes that interrupt those birds.
And what's your favorite curse word? And since we've been talking about Latin America, it can be in Spanish or whatever indigenous language you might know.
Funny you say that. I would think it's just going to be a Spanish one. It's going to be a word made popular by Chavez, carajo. So look it up. It's a good word to use, and you can use it in context where you can't curse otherwise because it's in Spanish.
Okay, well, all right. I'll make sure. I will make sure to check that out. And what profession, if you weren't doing the fantastic journalism and people power activism that that you're doing, so if you weren't doing journalism and being an educator and whatnot, what would you love to do?
I would be a marine biologist.
Marine biologist. Fascinating. And what profession would you absolutely not want to do under any circumstances?
Be a high school teacher. Though I have great respect for high school teachers. They work very hard and have a very difficult time.
Prefer way more like the college level of education and interacting with the students at that level?
I think that would be a bit better, but it's hard under any sort of education in this capitalist education system. I feel for anyone that teaches.
Wow, that is true, and here to that. And final one: if heaven exists, what would you like to hear God say when you arrive at the pearly gates?
They would say, "Welcome, comrade. Welcome to a classless society."
Well, we were joined on this edition of 1+1 with Alison Bodine of Fire this time. She is like I said, she is a people power movement person, not just Latin American solidarity, but for all oppressed people. And Miss Bodine, I have got to get you back on the program because I do want to know more about your time with Cuba's solidarity work and so forth. We have 1+1. We definitely support Cuba's right to self-determination. So we'd definitely love to have you back on for that, as well as Nicaragua. But until then, thank you so much for coming on the program. I look forward to having you back on, and really looking forward to the next online events you organize. And I'm definitely going to get my own subscription of Fire this time, and so that I can have it delivered to me in Belgium, and your book. It's now on my list
Sure.
of many books I need to get about Venezuela.
Yeah, we'll get you the subscription for sure. I'll put my book in the mail. Thank you, Youri, for your time and for all of your work on this important media project and the other things you do. I'll also just say for people, if they want to get involved or find out more about the Venezuela Solidarity monthly protest actions or an online picket, we have a discussion and then we take a group photo together. Those are always available at tinyurl.com/handsoffvzla. The next
Yes,
one.
and then do make sure to send it to me so I put that in the show notes. But until then, thank you so much, and power to the people, death to imperialism, death to Yankee Canucka imperialism, and death to settler colonialism. So
All power to you.